I've got with me everybody. Josh, who is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College in New York, and Josh and I actually had a chat, which some of you may remember, almost a year ago. We spoke about some more abstract stuff, economic theory, Marxism, capital, what is capital, what's capitalism, blah, blah, blah. That took 2 hours and it was a great chat, but I'd aimed to talk about some more practical policy stuff with Josh, and we realized that we needed to do another talk. So here we are almost a year later, and things have changed a little bit, although we'll probably still cover many of the same issues. And we're gonna talk about inflation, climate policy, and how the pandemic has made us really rethink a lot of our approach to macroeconomics. So Josh, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's just go with what I just said, because I think for a long time there's been a whole bunch of assumptions that have underpinned the way we think about macroeconomics. So inflation, GDP, unemployment, and there's been this, let's call it neoclassical approach. And since the pandemic, I think we've started to rethink them. A lot of things have happened that maybe don't mesh that well with that framework. I think there's been a search for alternative frameworks in the face of, the supply chain issues that we had and the inflation. So you actually have a recent article with ArjunJayadev, and that basically tackles exactly this question, right? Completely rethinking our approach to macroeconomics, to inflation, and to all these problems. So maybe could you just talk about, what the basis for this rethink is?
Yeah, the in some ways the pandemic crisis and sort of mini recession was very different from the sort of economic crises we've experienced in the past. I think for our lifetimes, economic crises happen when the flow of money through the economy is interrupted for some reason or another, usually having to do with some glitch in the financial system. And this was very different because the interruption came from the real side of production. So in some ways it was very different, but I think it was also very clarifying. And I think it helped us understand that a lot of the things that we believed about how the economy works were probably never really true, and certainly don't apply to the sort of situation we're in. And I think in many ways, these lessons reinforced the lessons that came out of the worldwide financial crisis of 15 years ago. So I think that the fundamental argument that we're trying to make in this paper is that the orthodox standard way of thinking about kind of macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy is, on one side, you've got the supply side of the economy, and that reflects the sort of real productive potential, reflecting the amount of labor we have available, the amount of technology we have available, natural resources. And that stuff sort of grows over time in a fairly steady way for reasons of its own. Technology gets better, the population gets bigger. And then on the other side, we have a level of current output and employment that's determined by spending. So, that's in the short run, businesses hire more people when they can sell more, and, lay people off when they're not selling as much. But that sort of happens independently. The potential of the economy, the real resources available are growing steadily over time. And then the amount of spending, can run ahead of that or fall behind that. And so the task of macroeconomic policy, which in recent years, of course, has meant, the central bank, the Fed in the US, the Bank of England, the ECB, whatever, their job is just to try to stabilize that flow of spending so it grows along with the sort of productive capacity of the economy. And I think if you took a macroeconomics course, in almost any college or university in the last, several decades, that would be the basic vision you would get. So what we've seen, again, in the wake of the financial crisis and again in the wake of the pandemic, is that really is missing some very important things going on in the world, because the productive capacity of the economy is not just given. It doesn't just grow in a sort of automatic way. The level of spending in the economy has big effects on the productive capacity of the economy. So we see this, for instance, very strongly with employment. This idea, there's a potential labor force and it depends on demographics. The population is aging, so of course fewer people are working. it really doesn't explain what's happened to employment at all. We've seen after the great financial crisis a big fall in employment, not just because there were more old people. Actually, old people were the one group where employment was going up, but because there was much lower rates of employment in the younger age groups. That clearly has nothing to do with demographics. And then, in the sort of boom that we've had following the pandemic, a lot of these people have come back into the workforce. So it's clear this is not a story about how many people are able to work or willing to work. It's a story about demand. The same goes for technology. We saw very slow productivity growth in the decade after the financial crisis. And a lot of people said, oh, well, we've used up all the great opportunities for innovation. There's no new technologies. Even people on the left say this. But then we find that where the demand is there, you actually see very rapid growth in productivity that particularly, and we should come back to this, but for instance, in areas of renewable energy, solar, wind power, it's clear that when you have a massive boom in spending, a massive direction of money into these sectors, the productivity rises very rapidly. So it's not the case that just you have productivity growth first, and then you just need to have enough spending to use that capacity. So what we've really seen is we can't treat the sort of productive side of the economy as fixed and given, and then just say, well, the macroeconomic problem is getting enough spending to fully utilize that, but not go over it, which is when you get inflation. And of course, the flip side of this story, of course, is the experience of inflation, which many people wanted to interpret in this sort of conventional way. Oh, well, we've got too much spending relative to the capacity of the economy. But when you dig into the actual inflation experience of the last couple of years, it really doesn't look like that at all.
Yeah, so I think this is really pervasive, this idea that there is some kind of supply side of the economy that essentially is, gifted by God, and it's just kind of, you can't go over the rate of growth that the economy can inherently manage because of things like technology, demographics, preferences as well, which you mentioned, and that has just led to a real limitation in how we use, I think, fiscal policies, in how government spends money, and in how we manage inflation. So you talk about some maybe what you could possibly call more modern approaches in the paper, right, that you could have to the inflationary problem.
Right. So what we've seen with inflation is that it does not look at all like a situation where just the level of spending is too high for the productive capacity of the economy. One way we can see that is, of course, if we just look at sort of conventional measures of the output gap in the U.S. and Britain, other countries that have experienced high inflation, it doesn't look like a positive output gap. The real GDP recovered very strongly after the pandemic, but just about back to its earlier trend. It didn't go over it. So we certainly, and at the time when inflation started rising, it was still well below, actual output was well below official estimates of potential. And then if you go in and you dig into the inflation numbers a little more, this is not an across the board rise in prices. It's driven by very specific sectors of the economy. We had in the reopening, we had a rapid rise in the price of goods because people were shifting, their consumption patterns thanks to the pandemic. In the U.S. and I think in other countries, you had a big rise in the price of food at home, groceries. As people stopped eating at restaurants, restaurant prices did not fall. That's a sort of asymmetry that's very common. Demand goes up, prices rise, demand goes down, output falls within a given sector. Then we saw this huge spike in the price of automobiles, which really, if you go back to the first period of really high inflation about 2 years ago, it was overwhelmingly auto-driven. And then, we had the war in Ukraine, which started about a year ago. And, we had a big spike in energy prices and food prices as those markets were disrupted. But it was these sort of, and then more recently in the U.S., again, I don't know the data, other places quite as well, we've had a rise in housing prices, which reflects a long-term problem of housing affordability in the U.S., but is not something to do with an overheated economy in the normal sense. So it isn't like we just saw prices rising in general. We saw these very specific increases in prices that we can link to specific disruptions on the supply side of the economy. And, the thing about this is, going back to the question of is the supply side independent of the demand side? if you misinterpret this, if you read this the way somebody like Larry Summers is going to read it, or Jason Furman, the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, who's been very visible, saying, well, this is just a sign we spent too much, the stimulus was too big, the economy's overheating, spending is running ahead of potential, that's why we have inflation. If you read it that way and you cut back on spending, you actually do, over time, reduce the productive capacity of the economy, and you make the problem worse. This was very clear early. One of the first things that happened that drove the first rise in prices, we had a big chip shortage, ongoing problem. And we also, people might remember, we had this big shortage of lumber. Suddenly you wanted to build anything out of wood, you couldn't get it at any kind of reasonable price.
I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, there was.
Yes,
I remember people talking about that.
I remember it vividly because I had to replace the fence around my backyard at that time. Yes. So it was, but then you ask, so what's the problem here? And it turned out, there was a very clear story where there'd been a lot of disinvestment in these industries after the 2007 to 2009 crisis. There was a collapse, as we recall, in North America and also in Europe, in housing construction. We had this housing boom, and then we had a much deeper and longer housing slump. Nobody was building houses in the early part of last decade. So it's a pretty bad business to be in if you're a timber producer, a lumber producer. If you're producing cut wood and nobody's building houses, that's a bad business to be in. And so people exited. They got out of that business. They closed down. They downsized. They certainly weren't building new, facilities. And then, of course, when you have this surge in demand, nobody's available to meet it. The same thing happened with chips. And also more specifically, in the early part of the pandemic, as we recall, the auto manufacturers said, well, obviously, this is going to be a terrible crisis. It's going to go on forever. People are going to be out of work, and nobody's going to be buying cars. So we had better cancel all our orders for chips. Well, come to find out, for once in our lifetimes, we actually had a decent macroeconomic response to the crisis. We actually kept people's incomes up. People were not, actually homeless and impoverished. And so they spent more money on cars, especially because they weren't taking vacations or eating out or whatever. And so you had the surge in demand, but these chips are very specialized, and you make the decision months in advance, long in advance, that you're not going to order these things, that the factories, they have to have specialized lines to produce this. It's not just a generic chip you can swap in from, one device to another. They're not producing the auto chips. They're not available. You can't produce cars. So the point here is that the reality of weak demand in the case of lumber, or the expectation of weak demand in the case of these chips, leads to a downsizing of productive capacity that actually makes it self-confirming. When you follow the advice of a Larry Summers or Jason Furman, you say, oh, well, we've got inflation, we've got too much demand, we need to cut back on spending. You basically tell companies there's no point in investing. There's no point in trying to build up capacity to meet this demand, because the demand is not there. It's not going to be there in the future. And so this is something we've seen very clearly. If you have a high level of spending in the economy and you sustain it, the productive capacity will rise to meet it. Other conditions have to be met, of course, as well. We have to, make sure that we have the other sort of institutional supports we need for investment. But investment will not happen if there's not demand for the stuff that investment is going to produce. And so this notion that, inflation is just a sign of too much spending and we have to cut back spending, it creates this sort of self-confirming slow growth in capacity and employment. People don't enter the labor market if there's no jobs. So you say, oh, there aren't any workers. Well, if you conduct your policy on the belief that there aren't any workers, then you will create a labor market that, in fact, people don't see it worthwhile, working in.
I mean, the way you put it in the paper, I thought was very simple, but also quite illuminating, because you said, under the mainstream approach, a kind of a rise in prices is seen as a sign that you need to kind of cut back and engage in some kind of, austerity or reduction in demand. But under your framework, a rise in prices could be a sign of like a temporary thing, right? As there's excess demand, prices do rise, but over time, if you're just patient and you allow it to work itself out, that could be, the path, not just a path, but the path towards having more output, higher investment, and therefore towards prices coming down, right? So you have to endure these temporary price blips. And it did strike me that this is basically what we've seen, right? I mean, inflation has come down since I last spoke to you, even quite quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think the story, the sort of team transitory story that inflation was about temporary supply interruptions has been totally vindicated. Because, it's true, the Federal Reserve did raise interest rates, and I wish they hadn't done that. I think that was a mistake. But the truth is, it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact. If you ask, how are these Fed hikes affecting demand in the economy? It's very hard to find a pathway that they could be doing it. It's true that new housing construction kind of leveled off after the Fed started raising rates, but we're still seeing more new houses built in the United States right now than we have at any point since in almost 20 years. Factory investment is at record levels. We've had the biggest boom in factory construction in the U.S. over the last a year and a half or so, probably on record in terms of the speed of the increase. Labor markets, okay, people are quitting their job a little bit less, which is a sign of a somewhat maybe weaker labor market. Few less jobs listed, but the unemployment rate hasn't gone up. The fraction of the population working hasn't come down. By any standard, this is an extremely strong labor market by historical standards. So the stuff that the Fed should be doing if they were going to bring down inflation, they haven't managed to do, and yet inflation has come down anyway. And what's more, the fall in inflation has really been in goods, tradable goods, which are not things that you would think are particularly sensitive to U.S. demand conditions, but are prices that are very sensitive to the state of global supply chains. So if you see a big fall in automobiles, as we've seen consumer durables, food prices, that's much more reasonably explained by these supply chain disruptions finally getting resolved than by anything the Fed has done. And, my colleague, Mike Consul at the Roosevelt Institute had a very nice analysis where he actually broke it down in more detail and found that the categories of goods where the prices have come down the most are the ones where the amount of consumption of those goods, purchases of those goods have actually gone up the most. So clearly this is not a story about, there was too much spending, we brought spending down and inflation leveled out, because the places where the prices have come down, the amount of spending is actually going up. That's a supply side story. So I think, the Fed was sort of, they turned the steering wheel in the wrong direction, but luckily the steering wheel wasn't connected to the car, so they didn't steer us off the road. And the result is that this kind of recovery of supply, recovery of productive capacity was able to take place thanks to the, very strong demand that we've had over the last couple of years.
I mean, even a very basic test. When were the first rate hikes? Because they weren't that long ago, right? And it seems to me like with the typical, monetary policy lag of 18 months to 2 years, which is what I was always taught, and I think makes some sense. I don't even think the rate hikes would have had a chance to have an impact through that channel. So it does strike me as odd when people, I mean, for all the reasons you listed as well, but even that basic test, I was thinking people was attributing this fall in inflation to central banks, but it hasn't been long enough. So that just seemed completely premature to me.
That's right. The standard thing you would hear is it's maybe a year for rate hikes to pass through to real activity, spending, employment, and then maybe another year for that to get passed through to prices. So, you might argue that the effect of the Fed still isn't here, but it's hard to see that first step. We should see that first step. And again, as people will point out, not all prices have come down, and there certainly are prices that are still high. I've mentioned housing is an area where, if you look at rent increases, they're still going up, although surprisingly softened a bit in the last couple of months.
The UK housing market's actually, the prices are declining now, which is unusual.
Okay, so that's the UK situation is a little different from the US situation, But if you look at the prices that are coming down, they are not the ones where you would expect an impact from the Fed to really be felt. So, there are certainly prices that are still rising, and those are the ones you'd think, in many cases, they're labor-intensive services, they're non-traded services where, demand conditions should matter relatively more. So I think it's very hard to make the case that inflation has come down thanks to the Fed. And I think there's a lot of evidence that where inflation has come down, and let's be honest, it has come down a lot. People are going to say, well, the statistics lie, the statistics aren't, and there's a lot of tricky things about calculating these numbers, but there are a lot of prices that we can measure pretty reliably, and there we see the increases over the past year, the past 6 months or 3 months are much smaller than we were seeing a year ago. And I think it's just overwhelmingly, I think more consistent with the evidence that this is about improvements on the supply side. And then this brings us back to the larger point, which is one condition for that supply side recovery to happen is that there is in fact strong demand. If you want businesses to invest in whatever logistics they need to move goods around the world, if you want to have more chip producing capacity so we don't have these shortages, if you want to have more sawmills operating so we don't have another spike in lumber prices, you need to actually have the demand there so that businesses think those investments are going to be worth making.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth saying with inflation and how people experience it, obviously, because inflation is the rate of change, right? So because we can say inflation's coming down, I think what some people hear is that prices should be coming down, right? And it's easy to look at prices, and obviously there was a bout of inflation in prices. Prices are much higher than they were, and I don't think they're gonna fall really. But the rate of inflation is the thing that we're talking about, right? But that obviously doesn't mean that it's not still hard for a lot of people. We just make that clear especially to chat, because
Yes,
some people are getting a bit upset.
Pushing back rather aggressively, and I don't want to say. I mean, right? People. When you're an economist, you think about inflation. You think about the change in prices. The question you ask is, if we can look at the same good, how much higher is the price than it was a month ago, or 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, or a year ago? But as a consumer, you don't necessarily think that way. You think, how high is the price relative to what something like this ought to cost or would normally cost? And believe me, I go into the grocery store, and I don't go to a fancy grocery store, and I come out with 2 bags, and it's $100, and I think, what is going on here? This is crazy. So because my mental notion of what the price should be is not what the price was 3 months ago or 6 months ago. It's what the price has been during my life as a person buying groceries. And yeah, so I think people say prices are still high relative to what one would normally expect them to be, and that's true. And even no one, I'm sure somewhere far out on the right you can find. I've actually started to see this show up among certain, like you might see this in an FT column, Financial Times columnist or something. Oh, well, we haven't really beaten inflation because the prices are still higher than they were. But the overwhelming conventional view, mainstream and more heterodox, is that inflation is about the change in the rate of prices. And if prices stop increasing, then inflation is over, even if they're still high relative to what they've been historically. And the other thing I think has to be emphasized here, because people lose sight of it, wages, and I'm sorry that I'm a little focused on US data here, just that's what I know best. But in the US, wages are up substantially more than prices are. We've seen, and especially wages at the bottom end of the distribution, have risen substantially more than prices have. So if you look at real wages, for the average American, like all wage earners, and you try to say, okay, what would if there hadn't been any pandemic, there hadn't been any inflation, what real wage growth would we have expected over the past 3 or 4 years? We're pretty much there for the average wage earner. But if you ask for people at the bottom end of the distribution, people with less education, people with more menial jobs, they're well ahead of that in terms of real wages. So I think, and I do think, honestly, there's a certain distortion in our perceptions that comes from the fact the conversation is not dominated by the people who've been the labor market winners over the last few years. The people who are really seeing the big wage gains are people with low wage, insecure jobs without college degrees, and they're not the ones who are, writing columns in the Financial Times or whatever. So I do think there's a little bit of a distortion in the way some of this gets discussed in public.
I saw an interesting article about measures of kind of financial well-being. And I mean, maybe we can get into this a bit, but it was critiquing the idea of real income. And basically, because measuring inflation, one of the issues you just discussed, right, with measuring inflation, but there are all sorts of issues, what's a representative household, what does the representative household buy, aggregation issues, and stuff like that. And it proposed that you actually use two measures at once, nominal consumption and nominal savings. The idea being that these are the raw measures, that there isn't as much room for, statistical tomfoolery as with real measures. But also, the basic logic is if your nominal consumption and your nominal savings are going up, then that's a pretty straightforward way of seeing people are probably quite financially healthy. And I do think you see them going up in the US. In the UK, it's less so. I think at least one of them is flatlining or dropping, as from what I remember. But I thought that was an interesting, different approach to the financial health of households.
Yeah, I realized I should have looked at some of the UK data before I got on here, given where some of the audience is probably coming from. So I'm not as sure about some of this stuff in the UK context, but in the US context, it is definitely true. If you are somebody who's coming, maybe into the labor market for the first time as a young person, if you work behind a cash register, if you work in retail or some relatively low paid job like that, the wages that you're getting have almost certainly well exceeded the price increases over the past couple of years. And working conditions have gotten better in other ways as well. I mean, anecdotally, but I talk with, students, my friends' kids, people who are out there looking for jobs, and they tell me stories. This guy, he's looking for a job at a coffee shop. He said, I used to work, the coffee shop jobs a few years ago, and so I struggled to find something. And now people are calling me saying, here, we'll pay you $25 an hour. When can you start? We just want somebody. The reality, the improvement in the labor market for people at the low end is real. The willingness of employers to make accommodations for parents and so on is, I think it's a real change. And I realize in a way a lot of people are still struggling with economic insecurity, and you can sound sort of complacent or out of touch to say, oh, but look how much better things are than a few years ago. But I do think we have to recognize this. And I think it's very important to recognize it, because the people who say inflation is this terrible disaster that's destroying living standards are saying that in order to justify policies that will leave working people much worse off.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be yes and, right? That's the approach we need to have. It's like, okay, yeah, it's not like everything's suddenly perfect for everyone, but this approach to inflation is much more progressive and egalitarian than increasing interest rates, right? And that's just going to hurt more people, and that's going to be worse for low-wage workers and a lot of middle-class workers too.
Right, and let's talk about something else, because price increases do hurt people. People who say, "What do you mean? My rent has gone up." There's something real. This is an experience many people have had. Landlords certainly taking advantage of the opportunity to jack up rents in many places, and other essential costs going up. There are real experiences people are having. I don't for a moment want to deny that. So the question we should be asking is, how do we respond to this? Do we respond to it by, as you say, jacking up interest rates, trying to raise unemployment? Because again, this is the orthodox story. If prices are rising too quickly, it's because wages are rising too quickly. And obviously, if you are a wage earner, a solution to rising prices that involves a wage cut for you is not going to leave you better off. So the question is, do we actually have to do this to control prices? And would it even work? And so I think one of the points that I and other people making this kind of argument have been saying is, when you've got the kind of supply-driven inflation that we've seen recently, you need to tackle it on the supply side. And that means in the long run, you have to figure out how we can get production back on track. And that means, if rents are rising, how do you build more housing? And in the short run, you can actually limit those price increases. I think there's a strong case for rent regulation, at least as a short-term solution, while we bring up, housing production in other ways. A lot of European countries, Spain is probably the most outstanding success story from what I can tell, have had very effective price regulations. They've had real strong limitations on the ability of energy prices, but other prices as well, and also targeted subsidies. If you say, it's energy's going up, prices are going up, you can limit that price. You can say no. They've sort of delinked from the European market, which because the complex way energy gets priced in Europe, it makes it hard to control prices at a national level. So they say we're just going to opt out of some of that, and you also subsidize it in Spain and Germany and France. People can't afford energy. You can subsidize it for low wage workers. You can make public transit free. There's a lot of things you can do to target the specific prices, as opposed to treating this as just there's too much spending in the economy. There's too much money flowing through the economy. Wages are rising too rapidly. Instead of saying that, you say, actually, no, we've got a specific set of prices that are rising because of supply interruptions or maybe, excessive monopoly power that companies are taking advantage of to raise prices. And so you're going to target those specific prices with a mix of supply side interventions and price regulation.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, this kind of circles back to the beginning of the conversation and the point I think we're trying to push home, right, which is that the orthodox approach to inflation has been to just look at the aggregate, right? And it's basically just like a couple of lines or 3 lines or something, depending on the model. And you've got kind of aggregate spending and potential output, where output should be. And, if you're above the level of output you should be at, then you cut spending. And if you're below, then you can increase spending. But what you're speaking to is a much more detailed sectoral approach where you basically have to take things on a sector by sector basis: housing, transport, food, timber as well, right? And that just requires a very wide suite of policy interventions.
That's right. Yeah. Again, if you look at Spain, they had this decoupling from the European energy market. They imposed hard caps on prices in the wholesale energy market. They fixed limits on energy prices to consumers and subsidies on top of that for lower income families. They also reduced taxes on energy on the other side. Windfall profit tax on energy producers. So it's a little bit of everything. And they also, Spain has actually implemented a pretty strong form of rent control to limit housing price increases. They reduced transit fare, actually free rail tickets, at least for some people. So, you have to take that sort of micro level response to the kind of inflation we've seen in the past couple of years, as opposed to treat it as some sort of macroeconomic imbalance.
Yeah, the Spanish example, I read that in one of your articles. I thought that was really interesting because I didn't know about Spain, but they've done so many things to try and basically ease the cost of living. And I think it speaks to this issue that a lot of people in chat are getting very upset about, which it is, cost of living and inflation, they aren't actually the same thing, right? Although they're obviously related. And I think in Spain, they've had an approach which is aimed at easing both, but certainly easing the cost of living for people with these kinds of subsidies and free public transport and so on. And maybe, according to your framework, doing that might have a long-term effect on aggregate inflation as well, a long-term positive effect or negative effect.
That's right. Well, you're right. You in the long run, you will do more to have a stronger productive side of the economy if you take measures like this, as opposed to this sort of, brute force, smash demand with a hammer approach and just try to reduce spending across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is a much better approach. Let's talk about price controls, because I think that's something that comes up in your paper, and it's been a really big issue in this debate. Some countries, I think France and Germany, did Spain pursue price controls as well? Yeah. There was this whole debate about, is that actually a solution to inflation, or is it just going to sort of backfire? Is it not going to help at all? So, where do you stand on that?
I think some form of price regulation is absolutely part of the solution. And I think part of the problem in this conversation, I should also say, Isabella Weber, an economist some people may have heard of, has been doing tremendous work in this area, and people should definitely, look for her stuff if they're interested in these questions. But I think part of the problem is that we've got this sort of false dichotomy where you either do completely conventional policy that's just about, higher interest rates and reduced spending, or else you have a rigid kind of price control, which is what people think about when they hear price control. The government just comes in and says, this is the price, and there's no give at all. But there's a big middle area in between those two, which I think is being pretty effectively explored in Europe, not as much in the US so far, where you take various, you do impose limitations on price increases. And the truth is, we already do this in lots of areas. This is not a radical thing. There's lots of regulations about prices, in any advanced capitalist country and in European countries, in a very extensive range of areas. I think if you look, I saw something, if you look at Switzerland, the majority of prices, there's some form of regulation in terms of what the acceptable price can be. So, but it doesn't have to be a hard ceiling. And then you can also talk about, targeted subsidies. You can talk about specific supply side interventions. In the U.S., we had this use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a device to try to stabilize energy prices, oil prices. You buy when price is low, you sell when the price is high. This is, what China has been doing for thousands of years, the ever normal granary. When there's a period of abundant harvest, the government, central authority buys up the grain, stores it. And when, there's a famine, then you sell that at a regulated price. And that allows you to stabilize prices. So there's a wide range of policies that directly target particular prices. So what I say, sort of the generic term, targeted price regulations, which may, in some cases, I think appropriately look like an actual control, where you just say the price can be this much and no more. But in other cases is something where you're intervening to try to shape that price without doing that sort of hard regulation. And I think absolutely, in a situation where we've got this sort of supply interruption, that's the appropriate policy. For instance, rent control is one that economists in general hate rent control, and yet there's a very simple logic. If you cannot build any more housing for some reason, if you have a city, and unfortunately we have a lot of cities that are pretty close to this, where for whatever reason new housing is simply not going to be built, then increased housing demand just shows up as a windfall for existing property owners, for existing landlords. And in that situation, there's really no economic cost to rent regulation. You're just sort of redistributing the windfall gains away from, okay, they're going to current tenants rather than landlords. But there's a lot of reasons we might think that's actually fair. We might think, people have a legitimate right to remain in their homes that they rent, that the property rights are not the only kind of right that we recognize. You might say that, stable neighborhoods and communities are something we value. You might say, you need to have, a diverse range of incomes that people can afford to live in a city, and if you want to have a functional city. So, there are a lot of reasons why, if there are severe limits on the amount of new housing that can be constructed, you really would like to see rent regulation. And, of course, in the long run, we need to build new housing. But I think the approach that I think has been successful, and I think is the one we want to be moving in, is a both-and approach. We don't want this false dichotomy. Oh, you need to address this problem only through increasing supply. Price regulation is sometimes necessary in the short run, certainly when supply is not there, or when the obstacles to increasing supply are hard to remove.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to ask you about rent control. I mean, this idea of, I think, emergency price controls, and you mentioned Isabella Weber, and I feel like she was pretty misrepresented, because I think when people hear price controls, they've got probably a very dated view of price controls that is completely unresponsive to economic conditions, that doesn't have any type of exceptions, that, just puts a sort of flat, I feel like you and I might agree, and Isabella Weber maybe as well, if we just said, okay, bananas can't be more than, 50p, that's quite a lot for a banana, isn't it? But, anyway, just some really flat price control that didn't evolve in relation to economic conditions or anything, that would be a bad idea. But fortunately, that's not really what anyone serious is proposing. It's a much more dynamic set of controls that, as you say, when there are supply constraints, whether short term or more fundamental, as in housing, right? If you can't build more housing, then you just stop the price from getting jacked up loads in response to an increase in demand. And that is just a redistribution. It's not something that's going to reduce the quantity supplied, because you can't increase the quantity supplied in that type of situation.
Right, that's right. I mean, I think nobody, I hope, is going to dispute that, let's say, in a natural disaster, that it's perfectly appropriate to say, you can't jack up the price of bottled water. That emergency supplies like that should not be sold at whatever the market will bear in a situation like that. And that when you've got a natural disaster, allowing people to charge $30 for a bottle of water is not sending any useful price signal. It is not going to encourage or speed up the resolution of whatever problem is preventing water from getting there. It's just going to create huge windfall gains for the people who happen to control the current supply, and windfall losses for everybody else. And a lot of housing situations, unfortunately, look like that. And I think existing rent control, as you say, is not it's not 50 cents a banana, or I don't know. Here at street vendors, I think they charge you 25 cents for a banana in New York, but they're probably cheaper in the grocery store. I don't know, but it's not a hard limit like that. It's typically a percentage increase on last year's rent for existing housing. If you live in a jurisdiction with rent regulation in the U.S. and in most other, Berlin tried to do the actual hard limit. As I understand it, it was actually quite popular, but it was struck down by constitutional court, so they haven't actually been able to implement it. But that was exceptional. Berlin actually did try to do the hard limit, an apartment with these characteristics rents for this much and no more. But the normal form of rent regulation is a percentage increase for existing units. And so if you build something new, you charge whatever you want to. There's no limitation there. So the issue is just, if you built, because if you think about the value of housing, right? I mean, where does it come from? Well, of course, the physical building, but a lot of it comes from the area where it's located. If you own a house or apartment building in an area that becomes more attractive for whatever reason, there's a huge windfall gain there. And there's no reason that gain should go entirely to the owner of that building at the expense of the people who live there. There's certainly no good reason why we should say, oh, well, in order to reap the windfall gain because they happen to own a property in an area that became more valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with anything the owner did. Therefore, in order for the owner to get those windfall gains, the people who actually live there should be displaced and give way for a higher paying tenant. I think that in a situation like that, which we know is a very common situation, there's really no economic cost to rent regulation, because again, this is not the reward for building something, for producing something. It's the reward for being lucky and being in the right place at the right time. And there's no ethical basis for it either. So I think that existing rent regulations are really actually well designed to hit the point where you're not talking about the reward for any kind of productive activity, but just who gets the windfall gains when there's some kind of supply constraint. And, I think now, rent regulation is great for protecting existing tenants. It doesn't address the underlying supply problem. And for that, you need some mix of public money, either direct public housing, some form of social housing, subsidized housing, and you need some type of, land use regulation reform that makes it easier to build stuff. And, I don't know what it's like in the UK. In the US, people have extremely angry arguments between those different approaches. But to me, they're really complementary. And this is definitely a place where we can say, yes, all of the above.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's quite funny. People sometimes talk about rent control or criticize it by saying, "Oh, well, it's not going to solve the housing crisis." And it's like, well, no, it's not. It's the point is not that it provides new housing. The point is that it prevents existing tenants from being exploited under certain conditions. It's literally that. And like you said, sometimes the sharp end of that is like eviction, right? If they can't pay for the rent increases. But yeah, like if you want to alleviate inflation, again, coming back to this point, right? The kind of long term solution is generally to expand supply, and that requires us to believe basically that we can just invest in various areas, whether it's housing or the timber industry, and increase the productivity of the economy and increase output.
That's right. It's funny. I was on a radio show a couple of years ago talking about rent regulation, and I said, well, it's not, it's true. This is not going to solve the larger affordable housing problem, but it is going to protect the rights of tenants to remain in their homes, and that's a social value. And the interviewer said, "Wow, I've never heard somebody suggest that tenants have a right to stay in their houses. Like this was some crazy radical idea." But yeah, I mean, I think you have to take a variety of approaches.
Yeah. I mean, so I think this the general theme, I think, and I think we can move on to another, I think, related paper that you were talking that you wrote, which was one about climate policy from a Keynesian perspective. But I think the mainstream approach, and Keynes said this of the mainstream approach 100 years ago, it's kind of austere. It is kind of, while it's not outright austerity anymore, it is that there are fundamental inherent limits to what we can do economically, and we can't exceed those limits because we just get inflation and all manner of troubles. But I think something that I see as a theme of your work and post-Keynesian work and institutionalist work maybe, and maybe it's a theme at Unlearning Economics as well, is that, we can do a bunch of good stuff at once. It's not like we have to just sacrifice one thing for another. It's not like there are real strict limits on, how much we can have climate progress, reducing emissions, fulfill human needs, have economic growth and employment. There are a whole bunch of measures that we can take that achieve all of those things at once, right? Whereas I think the mainstream approach really fetishizes this idea of trade-offs. It's like, oh, well, if you pursue climate, then, it's going to cost you employment or something like that. And that just doesn't have to be true. So you really unpack this in that paper.
Yeah, the paper is, I believe it's called Climate Policy from a Keynesian Point of View. Maybe it's a Keynesian perspective, or maybe both versions exist. Anyway, the fundamental point is this. The mainstream economics is very wedded to this idea that we are already producing as much as we can. The famous, probably most famous definition of economics is Lionel Robbins, writing the early 20th century, said economics is the study of the allocation of scarce means among alternative ends. So if you've ever taken an economics class, you probably encountered a definition sort of like that. And, what that assumes is that the means, the resources available to us are fixed, they're given, they're already determined, and the only question is how we are going to use them. And that means, of course, if you want more of something, you have to give up something else. If you want, for instance, to deal with the problem of climate change, if you want more decarbonization of the economy, you're going to have to give up, the other good stuff that you like to consume. And I think this vision of, decarbonization means sacrificing consumption, means giving up production that we need for other purposes. I think, first of all, it's a politically a non-starter because, as we've talked about, a lot of people feel, even in rich countries, feel like they're already struggling to meet their basic necessities. And of course, in most of the world, the poor countries certainly are not going to accept an arrangement that says they have to give up their development, their chance to become industrialized to solve a problem, which is largely, the result of the activity of the rich countries in the past. But I also think it's actually wrong because the economic problem is not allocation of scarce resources. It's coordination. It's how do we work together? How do we mobilize our collective abilities to solve problems? And the truth is, we are not fully using our capacities already, very far from it. The world is full of people with all sorts of wonderful talents and abilities, capacity to do all sorts of useful stuff, who aren't doing it not because they're doing something else that's more valuable, but because we don't have the institutions that allow them to work together successfully. And so if we can solve these coordination problems, we can do more than we're doing now. We can address decarbonization without giving up our current living standards in an aggregate way. Certain things, we may have to fly less or whatever, eat less meat. But you can't drive a gas-guzzling SUV, maybe. But in the aggregate, we can consume more. And in particular, this goes back to our discussion earlier about supply and demand, because what we know is that spending, the level of demand in the economy, doesn't just limit current production. What we've learned very clearly over the past 15 years, and maybe should have known already, is that it also limits the productive capacity of the economy. An economy that's experiencing a boom with a lot of spending doesn't just have a current high level of employment production. It also has a faster growth in its productive capacities, faster improvement in technology, faster growth of the labor force. We saw this very clearly during World War II in the U.S. and almost every other combatant power, even ones that were devastated by the war, like Germany, in some ways ended the war with more. There's a favorite. Alan Milward, an economic historian, points out that, if you measure something very easily measurable like machine tools, Germany ended the war with more than it started with, despite the obviously devastating bombing and so on that it was subject to. In the U.S., it's even more clear cut. The U.S. saw this enormous mobilization for the war industries. The level of war spending by the government at the end of World War II was pretty close to total GDP in 1939. So in just a few years, you added an additional amount of spending basically equal to the total pre-war economy, but it basically didn't crowd out anything. Consumption living standards during World War II actually went up. Again, not everything. There were no new cars produced, mainly because rubber was extremely scarce because Japan early on conquered Malaysia, where all the rubber came from. So, you didn't produce any new cars because you didn't have enough rubber to make tires. But for most areas, people were eating more ice cream. They were living in bigger houses. They were buying more new shoes. Living standards went up during the war. So there was no crowding out, even this huge. And what that shows you is the enormous amount of underutilized labor and resources in the economy at the start of the war. It wasn't just spending. Of course, it took a lot of planning. The federal government really had to effectively plan the economy. It was carrying out almost all the major investment financing, and a lot of the actual investment spending was directly allocating certain key resources like rubber, steel, aluminum, electricity. But if you solve the coordination problem and the demand is there, the amount of production that was possible was much greater than what was being used. And I think we've seen that very clearly, in less dramatic, but still very clear-cut ways recently. Again, if you have a prolonged crisis like you had after 2007, it's not just that you have unemployment and low output. You actually have a stagnation, a decline, an atrophy of the economy's productive potential. And the strong recovery after the pandemic has actually, brought new people into the labor force and fostered, very high investments. I said this investment boom, electronics manufacturing in the U.S., and this is also about the CHIPS Act and other things, is rising at a level that we just have hardly seen historically, perhaps not since World War II. So what this says is that, if we have a big all-out push to decarbonize the economy, that's going to look like an economic boom. It's going to look like a lot of spending, a lot of demand, a lot of employment, a lot of wage growth, and that's going to lead to a lot more output, a lot more productive potential, a lot faster improvements in productivity, technological change. It's going to increase. It's not going to reduce our ability to meet people's other needs. It's going to increase it. And I think, if you're an economist, this sounds sort of weird and heretical, or if you've taken economics classes, but from a policy standpoint, it's actually not so strange. If you look at like China, right, the leader now in green technology, producing more electric cars than the rest of the world put together, producing, I think, more, solar panels than the rest of the world put together, and so on. Huge. Do people say, oh, how nice, how charitable of China to make the sacrifices to help address the climate problem for the rest of us? No. Nobody says that. What they say is, look at that. China is, trying to get a lead in the big industries of the future. They're trying to get the benefits of getting out ahead and getting these new technologies online. It's very clear in that context that it's not a trade-off between addressing climate change and reaping more direct, immediate economic benefits, that the two really go together. And I think if we take that attitude towards the larger climate problem, it looks very different. It's not a problem of what are we going to give up in order to solve the problem of climate change. It's how are we going to solve the coordination problems, the financing problems, the planning problems that will allow us to actually experience this decarbonization boom.
It's pretty basic sort of business knowledge as well. This is the really weird thing about, like, economists have insisted on this mantra of diminishing returns. I think largely for mathematical reasons, actually. I think it was basically because the models don't come out if you don't assume that basically, the more solar panels you produce, the worse you get at it somehow. Obviously, so obviously that it's actually quite painful that it's taking this long to accept it. But if the more that businesses produce solar panels, the better they're going to get at it. The more they invest in it, the better they're going to get at it. The unit cost is going to fall. And so that's why, the kind of short-term trade-off approach doesn't really work, because you're not thinking about how you're kick-starting a process, right? A positive feedback loop. You're altering the trajectory of the economy fundamentally.
Yeah, that's right. I think this issue of increasing returns, it's really one case where an economics education gives you a completely different intuition than anybody else. A friend of mine, actually Arjun, my co-author on some of this work, he likes to do this with his students, because they've been exposed to some introductory economics concepts. He says, okay, supply, demand. Okay, so supply curve slopes up, I guess. So what does that mean? It means, well, you buy more of something, the price is going to go up. And then he says, wait, so is that what you believe? If you buy more of something, you're going to pay a higher price. And they say, yes, the supply curve slopes up. And then you ask them, wait, just think about it in real life. If you buy more of something, do you pay a higher price per unit? And of course, in the real world, everybody knows when you buy in bulk, it's cheaper. And the same thing goes in all sorts, in production contexts. When you produce more of something, the unit cost goes down. This is almost universal. There's people have studied construction of high-rise buildings. Even there, the later floors, typically the same building, it's just the same floor repeated over and over again. The later floors take less time to build than the earlier floors. There's this sort of learning by doing process that happens even in the course of putting up a single building.
If I make pancakes, then the later ones are obviously better, right? Like the first one's always rubbish.
Yes. There's this, it's in the paper I just quoted. I thought it was funny. It's a popular science book called Science in the City. It's a nice book. But at one point, written by somebody, though, with an engineering kind of background and not an economics background. And at one point she says, talking about the history of steel, and she says, well, the law of supply and demand. As demand for steel rose, the price came down, the supply increased. Like, she just assumes that's what supply and demand must mean, because it's so obviously true that as more steel was used in buildings, the price of producing steel came down because people learned to do it better. And the idea that economists actually think of it the other way, that as you do more of it, the price is going to go up. But it really changes the way you think about this climate problem, because if you think about it from an economist point of view, a mainstream economist point of view, you think the more we do, the faster we move at decarbonizing, the more expensive it's going to get. Okay, the low-hanging fruit, there's a few places you can put wind farms and it's relatively cheap. But if we try to build a lot of wind farms, we're going to have to site them in worse locations and it's going to get more expensive. That's how you think about it if you're an economist. But if you're somebody with a business or engineering background, it's obvious that as you build a lot of windmills, the price is going to come way down. You have to, if you scale it up quickly, it's actually going to be cheaper than if you just take a few opportunities to do it where it's cheapest right now. And again, that really changes the calculation about, is there a hard constraint on how much we can decarbonize, or a trade-off? Because if we can do this in a big way, we can actually, there's no reason that the price of producing in a less carbon intensive way should be greater than the kind of production we have now. In many cases, there are probably a lot of currently unexploited opportunities to do things better and cheaper. And, the other side of this, and I think it's important, is that people say, oh, there's a straight link from GDP to resource use. And so if you're going to have growth, you're going to have more carbon, you're going to have more resource consumption. It's not going to be sustainable. And I think I understand, because historically, certainly, we've seen that link very strongly in a lot of cases. So I understand how people get there. But I think if you actually think about what GDP is measuring, it's not measuring any sort of physical quantity
Mm.
that would have this sort of inherent link to real resource use. We're measuring GDP, we're measuring market prices, how much people want to pay for something. And if you're producing something that is valuable because people, as measured by people's willingness to pay for it in the market, that's GDP growth, whether it's increasing the physical throughput of the economy or not. And so I think there's a certain assumption maybe in weirdly, I think, shared both uh, by mainstream economists and by perhaps people on the degrowth side, an
Mm.
assumption that the only way you can really meet human needs is with the kind of production that we have now. That the only stuff that people want or will make people happy that they'll be willing to pay for is the kind of stuff we're producing now. And I think that's really, really not true. I think people actually, for instance, love to live in dense, walkable cities because that's why it's so expensive to live in the center of any major city, because people really want to live there. And they don't have the opportunity to do so because we have this chronic problem of underproducing housing in these areas that
Mm.
we've talked about before. And if you can make housing, for instance, more available in these dense, walkable cities where transit is an option, you can increase GDP. Certainly, that will be producing something that will have a very clear market value. And you will, in my opinion, be greatly increasing people's well being and life satisfaction. And you'll also be decarbonizing the economy. I think this assumption that the stuff we're doing now, the only way you can have a decent, enjoyable food is if you ship bananas halfway around the world. It's the only thing people want to eat. I think there's lots of ways that we can make, let's say, food more sustainable, less carbon intensive, that actually are going to be very satisfying to people. People with money, the disposable income, love going to farmers markets
Mm.
and buying local produce. That's actually, the market says, is actually more valuable than industrial produce. So if you can, if that, and I'm not saying that we necessarily all have to, eat stuff that was grown by within 50 miles of our house, but I'm saying there's a lot of cases where the transition to something that is less carbon intensive may also be something that people actually prefer, both in terms of our actual substantive satisfaction in life and is reflected in the market price of things. So I think we really need to reject this assumption that the pattern of production we've got now is sort of optimized to meet human needs. And we actually should say, there's a huge amount of kind of unexploited opportunities to organize our economies and societies in ways that will be both less carbon intensive and more, people will find more satisfactory, more will make people happier.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, on the subject of degrowth, I was actually going to ask you about that. So you're sort of anticipating my questions quite well. But it's worth saying, you know, you have an expansion, right? A Keynesian climate policy, let's call it, right? But you can also do some of the things that the degrowthers might like that wind down more harmful economic activity at the same time. So you could do things like, for instance, limiting the use of cars, especially fossil fuel cars, especially in city centres. You can do things like reduce working hours, which estimates suggest could reduce emissions. You can try and eliminate things like planned obsolescence, those types of things, and those are going to wind down economic activity, but the Keynesian climate policy is going to increase it. What's the net effect on GDP? I don't know. We don't need to focus on whether it goes up or down, right? We just need to do
That's right.
the things that are good.
That's right. In a way, again, I think some sort of degrowth arguments sort of fetishize the same sort of single metric of the economy that the orthodox economics tells us
Yeah,
measures
it's really weird.
everything we need to know. You know, the orthodoxy says the number must go up, and so somebody else says no, the number must go down. But actually, that number is not the thing we should be necessarily looking at all, or certainly not so much.
Hmm.
That said, I do have to say, from my point of view, I think that the net effect of a rapid program of decarbonization would, at least in the short run, show up as a higher measured GDP. Because however you're going to transform our material world, whatever you think it is, whether it's a shift from global supply chains to more local production, shifting from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, from dispersed, settlements to dense, walkable cities, whatever it is, making that transition is going to require a lot of labor, a lot of
Mm.
coordinated human activity. And in the world we live in, the way we mobilize labor and bring about that activity is by spending money, by paying people to do things, by hiring people to do things. And so, the transition period, I think, no matter what we imagine, sort of the end state to be like, a rapid transformation of the economy is going to look like an economic boom. And to the extent you're retiring a lot of existing capital goods, you're decommissioning, coal plants, you're raising suburban subdivisions, whatever you're doing, and replacing them again in the way we measure GDP and in the way we experience the economy. That's going to look like a boom.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, certainly in a short-term boom, right? And then, I mean, I don't know if you wind down economic activity in some senses, like I said, with a lower frequency of purchases, perhaps because your iPhone actually lasts for some time instead of no time at all, or something like that. And in terms of maybe shorter working hours, then maybe over the long term you get a slight decline. But again, what happens to GDP in this? I don't know. GDP is a measure that's very disconnected from the physical goings on of the economy. I just want to talk a little bit more about climate policy itself, because the mainstream solution to climate change and pollution and everything is a tax, right? A carbon tax or a greenhouse gas tax. Whereas I think what we're talking about is a much more general transformative approach. And I don't know if you know about the idea of carbon lock-in, if you heard about that.
No, no.
Yeah, so it's this idea that basically taxes can't really work because what you're doing is you're taxing something that everybody uses, whether that's industries that are dependent on carbon, cars, obviously, and commutes that people have to do, but you're not actually giving them an alternative. Now, in a mainstream model, the type of one we've been discussing, everything will just sort of adjust, right? And you'll just get a kind of, the price of carbon has gone up, so people will substitute to something else. In the real world, where there's a big distance between these different production methods, and they need a sort of jump start. People need a jump start to shift. That's not really going to happen. So yeah, I mean, what's your view of this whole debate about carbon taxes? Do you advocate them, or are they,
No,
no good?
I think you're right. I think there's, I was in a meeting a few years ago with a very senior, well, it was Jason Furman, and he said, the only question I have about climate policy is the carbon tax 80% of the solution, or is it 100% of the solution, or is it somewhere in the middle? So that was from the point of view of a kind of senior Obama era Democratic official. That was kind of the range of legitimate debate.
It kind of makes me a bit angry, that type of thing, I have to say, like, because I don't know. I mean, how you interpret it. You're telling the story with a smile. You can't see, but I've got my head in my hands. Because I do feel like there's this great degree of certitude, like just intellectual arrogance sometimes. And I'm sure this guy said it in a lighthearted way or whatever, but it's just like to narrow the question that much, to have that confidence, like I don't know, it confuses me.
Yes, well, I agree with you, but the positive thing is that people like him are not in charge at the moment.
Okay.
There's been a real shift in the conversation around climate change, and I think a recognition that the carbon taxes are not going to do the job. I think it's really a real sea change, because that was absolutely the consensus, a decade or 15 years ago. And so I think one of the reasons people have realized this is just in general the limitations of the price mechanism. That we don't live in this sort of idealized market economy where everybody's just processing price signals and switching from this to that when the price changes. There's a lot of planning that goes on in the private sector as well. There's a lot of financial constraints. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so you need to take more active measures to direct investment. And that's why we've seen this swing towards industrial policy as embodied in things like the IRA and the CHIPS Act here in the US, and some more similar but measures in other parts of the country. and of course pioneered by China and other East Asian countries. But I think there's a more specific reason that you touched on, which is this issue of increasing returns. That things often are high cost at a small scale, and as the scale grows and as more experience is gained, the cost comes down. So you're in a situation initially, let's say, where the cost of fossil fuel power is much lower than the cost of, renewable energy. And if you, in that situation, impose a carbon tax that is large enough to close that gap, that's going to be incredibly disruptive, leaving aside the fact that it will be politically totally unpopular. We saw what happened in France when they tried, to take a little step down that road, and you had these, yellow vest, protests. But besides, it's actually just going to be extremely disruptive. Energy is an input into almost everything. And if you raise that price overnight by the amount that you would need to close that gap, it's going to be completely disastrous for all kinds of production. It's going to, so on the other hand, precisely because initially renewable energy is a small part of the market, a targeted subsidy for renewable energy is fairly cheap and quite easy to do. And so a targeted subsidy will then allow that renewable energy. See, the mainstream economist, again, imagining a world of decreasing returns, is going to say, well, eventually, you're going to reach the point where the marginal benefit of having more renewables in terms of climate just offsets the higher cost. So that's where you want to get to. And really a tax on carbon, a subsidy to renewables, they're really just two versions of the same thing. That's how a mainstream person would see it. But because the cost of renewables actually falls as the scale rises rather than rises, it's actually very different, because to start with a tax, you're going to need a huge tax. But if you start with a subsidy, targeted subsidy, maybe the subsidy for the individual producer is large, but the total cost is small because the industry is small. And as the scale rises, the cost disadvantage actually shrinks rather than grows. The costs come down for renewables rather than up. And you actually can eventually phase out the subsidy completely, or it certainly doesn't have to get bigger. And so the economic disruption of going that way is much less than if you tried to do it with a carbon tax. And then, there's lots of other stuff where the other obstacles just make the tax sort of irrelevant. There's a huge amount that can be done with weatherizing housing. I think probably in the UK even more than in the US in this respect. And I think people in general recognize that it would be a good idea to do this stuff, but it's not that you need a stronger price incentive. It's that there's upfront costs that are quite large, so you need financing if you're talking about homeowners. There's coordination problems if you're talking about a commercial building, and the tenant pays the electricity bills, but it's the landlord who would have to make the investment. Then you got a problem there. If there's not a lot of knowledge about how to do this, who to hire, there's a lot of coordination problems you have to solve to make this happen at scale, and it really has nothing to do with the price. So I think there's a real movement away from the idea that the carbon price is the central part of the solution, or maybe even part of the solution at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the example I always think of is if you if you have like your traditional American suburb, which is built around roads, and you just sort of tax cars or something that affects the price of petrol or cars or something, then you just expect people to magically be able to get to work some other way. Obviously that's not going to happen, right? There won't be the infrastructure for cycling, there won't be public transport. You have to create those things, and I think that's the subsidy approach. What it has, the carbon tax approach doesn't, which you miss with neoclassical models, because I think under certain assumptions they'd be equivalent in a mainstream model, right? A tax
That's
on,
right.
yeah.
That's right. That's absolutely right. They'd be equivalent. A lot of that has to do with decreasing returns. You abstract away from all the coordination problems. And also, we've been talking a lot about increasing returns at the level of an individual industry, but there's external, increasing returns as well, and there's complementarities. Economists like to talk about substitutes, but there's often complementarities. If you want to drive to work, that's easy to do in a society where everybody else drives to work. There's roads, there's parking lots, there's abundant gas stations, there's probably. So if you want in a typical American suburb to cycle to work, it's much harder to do. The streets aren't set up for that. There may not be a bike, place to park your bike. There probably isn't a shower at your workplace. If you're, living in parts of, Texas, people are going to be screaming at you in rage as you try to bike down the shoulder of the road. So, because it's not expected, it's not normal. So, if you try to use a price mechanism, you're kind of assuming that everybody sort of individually can make this transition kind of on their own, taking everybody else's choices and behavior for granted, as is given the way they are now. But the way these things actually happen is the whole switch has to happen at once. And that really doesn't, the price mechanism doesn't work well for that. You need a much more directive kind of way of getting that to happen. Again, in a development context, I think, this is pretty obvious, or at least it used to be. If you want to industrialize your country, you can't do it one business at a time. Your transportation network won't be useful if you've got an export industry, you need a transportation network. If you've got a transportation network, you need port facilities, you need electricity generation, you need all this stuff, and it all has to grow up together. There's no point in building a port if there's nothing to ship out through it. There's no point in building a factory if there's no ports to ship stuff through. There's no point in building a big new power plant if nobody needs the electricity. There's no point in building, an aluminum smelter if there's not going to be any electricity for it. So all this stuff has to kind of happen together, and decarbonization is sort of a similar problem.
It's amazing because listening to you, and this isn't a criticism of you at all, but everything you're saying is in a way very, very obvious, right? It's like common sense kind of logistics, engineering, logic. I don't understand why it's taken us so long to get to this point in economics.
A lot of the problem here is escaping from economics in a way. We have this very powerful ideological vision of the world as a system of decentralized markets with these nice supply and demand equilibria. And that shapes so much of our thinking that you actually really have to work very hard just to get out of that, even though once you're out of it, you're like, why was I ever in that box to begin with?
Yeah. Well, dare I say, unlearning economics. I've actually been reading Thomas Sowell quite a lot because I want to make a video about him. Do I want to make a video about him, or have I been pressured into my audience into doing it because he's a very big figure online, I think, and on YouTube he's very, very popular. So, but he's very much, if you look at his core framework, it is the bare bones kind of neoclassical. He really buys into this idea of scarcity, economics as scarcity. He kind of defends that, and I don't think there's any notion of these kind of increasing returns. He spends a whole part of his first book, Knowledge and Decisions, defending diminishing returns using a farm example, of course, about two farmers with cattle and there's too many cattle on the, you know what I mean? But it's just these kind of fables seem to underpin a lot of thinking that's on the right and also in the mainstream if you dig far enough, although they hide it more and they have exceptions, I think.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, but it also, it's a problem because the tools that are used for analyzing all sorts of concrete problems. What government bodies do to estimate the costs of things. All this stuff is being done using this language. And it's interesting. If you read the Financial Times, you talk to people with a business background. They often have this sort of split consciousness. On the one hand, they have their own experience, which tells them this isn't how things work. But on the other hand, they have tended to study economics and probably also see a certain value to the kind of vision of the world as, this is efficient if you let people just use their private property as they see fit and pursue a profit that's going to lead to the best outcome for everybody. There's a political value to that vision. So there's a kind of push and pull between, that and then what they actually know from their own firsthand experience.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really strange phenomenon that I think maybe when people hear the word economics or they start talking about aggregates, all the basic lessons go out of the window. And I think it's interesting to me because we are talking about a broadly post-Keynesian framework, I'd say, if we had to put a label on it. And
that's right.
It's very much microfoundations are like the idea that we should found macroeconomics in microeconomics. It may be true in some cases, in other cases it doesn't really work because you've got aggregation issues. But it does strike me that post-Keynesian economics in a way has much better microfoundations than mainstream economics, because we have an approach where you go and ask businesses how they actually work. You look at like the cost curves of businesses, that's what you call them, right, in your paper. You see that they have increasing returns, they have learning by doing, everything we've spoken about, and then you can look at the whole economy and say, well, wait a minute, maybe investing in the capacity of the whole economy might produce these effects on aggregate as well. So it seems very micro-founded to me, and it seems to do a better job of that than the mainstream does.
Yeah, that's right. Honestly, the whole idea of micro foundations is a little bit of it's a little dishonest, because a lot of the micro foundation is not really micro. It's the notion of this single representative optimizing, agent making all the choices in the economy. It's kind of the opposite of micro. It really means just basing it in a story about sort of rational optimization under scarcity. And, it's true, post-Keynesians in general are much more interested in actually listening to business owners and decision makers and saying, how do you decide, on investment? How do you just make employment decisions? And you get a much richer and more realistic vision, and also one, I think, that's much more consistent with our vision of how the world works. Things like, this comes back to our discussion towards the beginning of this video, like interest rate. And why haven't they had the impact? Well, if you ask, there's this great paper, and I'm blanking on the name of the author, but he's in a business school, which is probably significant, on taking a lot of survey data over quite a number of years, asking executives how they make investment decisions, and interest rates are just not a factor for most of them, or a very secondary factor. There was another nice paper recently that looked at these earnings calls. I wrote a piece about it, you might have seen, but he looks at earnings calls between, executives and investors, shareholders. And a lot of times they'll say something about what their required return is for new investment is, what their hurdle rate, kind of the minimum return they're looking for from new projects. And so you can put those numbers together. And then you can ask, how does this thing move up and down over time on average? And the answer is it doesn't do so very much. It's 10, 12, 15%, whatever is the return they want, is pretty much stable over time. And it really has nothing to do with the current interest rate, or very little. So, the idea that the Fed is affecting investment decisions all throughout the economy by turning this one knob, it sounds nice in theory, but if you actually look at evidence about how businesses make investment decisions, it doesn't really hold up at all.
Yeah, this is a really important point, because I think in a mainstream economic model, the interest rate kind of affects everything, doesn't it? Everybody's making intertemporal decisions, and when you look at how businesses actually work, and maybe consumers to a degree, they're much less responsive. So how because interest rates, one question for you is, interest rates at some level do work to contain inflation, right? Especially increasing interest rates, I think eventually does tend to have an effect on inflation, the intended effect. So if it's not through business investment, then what is actually going on there? How does that happen?
Well, I think the case is honestly less clear-cut than people make it out to be. The big success story is supposed to be the Volcker shock, seconded by the Bank of England and other central banks at the end of the 70s. But, and it's certainly true that the Volcker shock, interest rates went way up, all kinds of business spending came down, unemployment went way up, wage growth came down, and inflation eventually came down. But it's not clear that interest rates alone were the decisive factor there, because, of course, that period also saw a much broader attack on labor and a broader kind of policy shift. Volcker himself, said, one of the most decisive things in the defeat of inflation was Ronald Reagan's decision to fire the striking air traffic controllers. Yeah. So that's not interest rate policy. Whether interest rates alone can have this effect, I think the jury is a bit out on that. But to the extent that they do, I think they don't do it in a kind of smooth, incremental way. But when the hikes get big enough to really disrupt the routine activities within the economy, and that may come through investment decisions, spending decisions, It also may come at the point where a critical mass of businesses and families are facing financial distress, aren't able to service their debts, fall into bankruptcy. If you can pop an asset bubble like happened in 2007, I think the jury is certainly out. If the Fed had not hiked, what would have happened to the housing market? It's not obvious. Maybe the bubble would have burst more or less the way it did. Maybe it would have been gentler. Maybe we would have had permanently elevated housing prices. We can't really rerun the tape, but certainly to the extent that that the policy worked, it was not simply a smooth slowing down of economic activity. It was you reached a tipping point, a stall speed, and so I think if you don't reach the point where this becomes really disruptive, it may not have much of an impact at all.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I always think it kind of it may solve the disease of inflation by killing the patient, right? Basically, it's like
right, and if it doesn't kill the patient, it may not do much. Do much on the disease.
Yeah, right, exactly. And this is, I mean, what you're recommending. I think the ideal, at least in my mind, is a kind of institutionalized monitoring of different sectors. And the prices and bottlenecks in those sectors, and very detailed kind of microeconomic data essentially, and the ability to respond to that with various policy measures. I mean, is that something that you would like to see ideally? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think we really need to stop assuming that inflation is a macroeconomic phenomenon, that it's an economy-wide phenomenon having to do with like too much spending relative to productive potential, too much money chasing too many goods. I think certainly in our post-pandemic inflation, but I think perhaps arguably in many historical inflations, what we're seeing is sort of disruptions in particular markets that result in higher prices, and you need more targeted interventions. I mean, the other thing I think we should be really clear about here is inflation is a symptom. You can have a fever and have a lot of underlying conditions that would want to be treated very differently. And economies, when you see a rapid rise in the average price of goods and services, the thing we call inflation, there's a lot of things that may be underlying that, and there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. In some cases, certainly historical hyperinflations, I think, actually do fit the model of literal money printing. When a government's capacity to finance itself really breaks down, there's not a functioning tax system, there's no banks you can issue bonds to, and you literally are financing government by printing currency, that's hyperinflation. That's a distinct phenomenon. It's not really anything like the inflation that you see in other contexts.
Wow.
In a lot of developing countries, prices are very tightly linked to the exchange rate.
Yeah.
If you see rapid inflation in a lot of developing country contexts, it's almost always because there's been a big fall in the value of their currency relative to foreign currencies. That's not, a big driver of inflation in the U.S. or Europe, but in a lot of the world, that would be the number one cause of inflation. So I think we should really be kind of skeptical of anybody who says inflation is always and everywhere anything, because it's a symptom that can reflect a lot of underlying problems. But I think certainly in the case of the pandemic, almost certainly in future climate disruptions, and arguably in some recent episodes of higher inflation in advanced countries, what we're seeing is disruptions in specific markets that need to be addressed in a targeted way rather than any sort of economy-wide phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes with the more monetarist kind of, I mean, in one sense, the monetarist definition of inflation as too much money chasing too few goods is correct, but that it doesn't tell you much about the details, right? And I was trying to think of examples that kind of fit with the mainstream view, and I was thinking maybe historical examples where money has been backed by gold or silver, and there's been an influx of gold or silver and then a rise in prices. I think you get maybe a clear kind of monetarist style story then, but right now that's just nowhere near what we're having. We don't even have currency that's backed by precious metals for a start, but it's much more complex.
That's right. People have an instinct that comes from the sort of imagined gold standard world where you can make this kind of clean separation between the price level on the one hand and relative prices on the other hand, and they're totally different in terms of what drives them and so on. And that's not the world we live in, because we don't have that sort of fixed money supply. more spending on some particular good or service, higher price on particular good or service, there's no reason to expect that to translate into lower spending or lower prices somewhere else in the economy. Whereas, again, in the sort of, if you imagine a hard gold standard world, and I think it's debatable how much this ever was historically the case, but, we can say historically there are cases that look closer to it than if you have more spending in one place, you got to have less spending somewhere else unless the money supply increases. So the relative price level questions are, but yeah, it's not the case today. If you have a spike in auto prices, then the average price level just goes up. You don't have any offsetting fall in prices somewhere else unless there's some independent reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you mentioned labor just a little bit ago, actually. So should we talk about class war? Because I think, some people in chat were kind of thinking about this earlier, talking about this earlier. You said in 2022, I'll quote you first. So you said, the great political challenge of the climate transition may turn out to be not that ordinary people have to accept getting less, but that business owners have to accept ordinary people getting more. And just recently, you probably saw that Tim Gurner, the millionaire, said, we need to see pain in the economy. Unemployment needs to jump 40 to 50%. Employees think employers should be thankful for them. We need to kill that. So, I mean, this whole approach, right, to inflation, the maybe wrong-headed approach, is it kind of a way of keeping, the higher returns going to capital, more returns going to the boss class versus laborers?
I think that's absolutely right. Although I might phrase it a little bit differently than that. I think, in the famous essay by Michael Koletsky, the political aspects of full employment, what he stresses is that bosses certainly care about profits and profitability, but they care even more about status and authority. And that discipline, I phrase something like discipline in the workplace is even more valued by employers than high current profits. And so I think there is certainly an aspect of simply distribution of income, and rising wages are threatening because they do shift income from profits to wages. But I think what's even more threatening is precisely the change in the relations between workers and employers that really comes out in that line you just quoted. That this is a situation where who has the power in this exchange is different from what they're used to, and that makes them very, very uncomfortable. I think, and it's politically threatening, and it's not just threatening to them. It's a challenge for society because we have organized our societies for many decades around the idea that labor is going to be weak, workers are going to be desperate for work, and that labor for an employer is going to be abundant and available. And a lot of aspects of our economy are going to have to be different in a world where those things are no longer true. So that's why I say there, this notion of scarcity, that we have to give up stuff in order to decarbonize, I think is not only just wrong, but it's actually pointing us in the opposite direction of the real problems. Because it's not a problem of how much are you going to have to give up, how much you're going to have to sacrifice in order to save the problem. The problem is that working people are going to have a lot more power in a world where we are rapidly phasing out carbon fuels and replacing them with renewable energy, in a world where we're rapidly, reorganizing our settlement and land use patterns to favor denser cities, in a world where we're, shifting away from these global supply chains, where we're doing all the things we have to do, even in a world where we're, consuming less plastic crap and more live entertainment, which we can certainly make our lives better and be less carbon intensive. All that stuff empowers workers. All that stuff means more demand for labor. All that stuff means businesses have to seek out people to do this work. And it's an environment where, it's a labor shortage, a relative labor scarcity. It's an environment where wages will go up as they have been going up in the post-pandemic period, in a situation where workers are going to get to be pickier about the kind of jobs they'll take, in a situation where employers find they have to do things like offer job training, which they've gotten used to not having to do because skilled workers were endlessly available. Where they're going to have to be flexible about work schedules, where they're going to have to go out and recruit, where they're going to have to hire people that they would rather not hire, whether that means people who are members of a racial minority or immigrants, women, people with a criminal record, young people. In an environment of abundant labor, they can pick and choose. I only want to hire somebody who looks a certain way. You can't do that when labor is relatively scarce. And there's going to be, there already is, and there will be tremendous pushback from business owners and their political advocates for that, against that. There's going to be a tremendous hostility to a world where labor has more power, and we're going to need new institutions. We have a situation where we say, oh, if we've got a distributional conflict, we've got a concern about wages rising too rapidly. Well, we just slow down demand, we push up unemployment until workers have to settle for less. If we're taking that off the table, partly because we don't like it and we don't think it works, but also because we actually have urgent problems to solve that we cannot afford to, slack off on trying to solve. Mm-hmm. If we're in a sort of war mobilization scenario, then we can't do that, but we still may have a problem. We may have a problem if we see, higher wages, in my mind, are a good thing. And I think if you've got some kind of progressive politics, you should never say, oh, we need less bargaining power for workers so wages go down. Just never, ever say that. But you still can say, well, we've got a problem because wages in this sector are rising really fast and not elsewhere. Prices are rising really fast here, and we need to do something about that. There's some equity concerns. Some workers, are really getting a big gain and others aren't. So far it's been low wage and, relatively marginalized workers who are getting the big gain. So it's not an issue, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And so we need to say, well, we're going to need to think about other institutions. We're going to need unions to play a bigger role in wage determination as they did historically. Historically, in a lot of countries, people thought of organized labor as a way of controlling inflation, as a way of limiting inflation, because you could actually bargain over wages and prices in a centralized way. Or you could say, instead of rapid wage increases, let's give you something else that you want. Let's give you some role on the shop floor. Let's give you, co-determination rights in a way that's going to make workers better off, but is not going to drive up prices. So you need to have the institutions to do that. We're going to need more price-setting institutions. We're going to maybe need some centralized management of scarce inputs. Again, like you have in a war mobilization. So these are real problems that have to be solved. But we're not going to solve them if we've got this mindset that the problem is scarcity and what are we going to give up. We have to actually manage this situation of boom, rapid growth, and rising incomes. And I think the big obstacle to that is going to be precisely people like the one you quoted, who find the idea of an empowered working class extremely threatening.
It's probably no coincidence, right? A lot of the big pushes towards a bigger welfare state came, after the mobilization in the war, right? Which you've used as an example. It's like that. It kind of creates, that kind of economic boom does create these conditions of full employment where labor and the population in general can just demand more, and it shifts the balance of power in favor of the ordinary citizen.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, in the pandemic, we had this tremendous response, and there's never, I don't think, been something like it, where you had this incredible economic disruption, by official measures, it was the steepest recession ever, although also a very short one, a very deep fall in production and employment, and yet incomes went up during this period, ordinary people's incomes, and especially at the bottom during the pandemic, because of very generous, this was, in the U.S., there were these very generous employment subsidies and unemployment benefits, income support measures. In some parts of continental Europe, it was more subsidies to employers to keep people on the payroll while they weren't working. But one way or another, in the developed world, in the rich countries, we managed to go through this disruption without any loss to people's incomes at all. And, this is a tremendous, I think, accomplishment that we really, if you're on the left, you don't want to downplay this, because this should now be our baseline for what we expect, what we demand from the government in the future. It does not have to be the case. If businesses, screw up somehow, if finance, blows itself up because they all overinvested in some dumb thing, which they do every so often, that doesn't have to be a calamity for the rest of us. We've proven that actually you can keep people in their homes, you can keep people, maintain people's incomes despite that. So that has to be, but from the other side, economic crises and mass unemployment are very politically useful. They keep people in their place. They keep people grateful to have a job at all. And so from the other side's point of view, and the quote, there's lots of quotes like the one you did, lots of people, business owners saying this is terrible. People don't want to work anymore. You hear it all the time. Well, it means they're not as desperate for work as they used to be. And that is a real change. And it's something that is going to be, I think, until and unless we actually do get a deep recession, there's going to be this constant drumbeat that, people don't want to work, labor has too much power, they're too demanding, wages are too high. And so we have to actually prepare ourselves to face that. We have to be both defending the idea of an economy that doesn't have the kind of mass unemployment, an economy where people have a little more power over what kind of work they'll take and the conditions they'll work with, but also to be thinking creatively about the institutions to make that sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the I've always liked the term quiet quitting, as that like people call it quiet quitting, and it's like it's not quitting, it's doing your job, like it's doing literally your contractual obligations, like and that's apparently quitting. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Like people are just so overworked and like email and everything just being always on and stuff like that, and people are expected to go above and beyond. I mean, I've had friends where they're told that working at this company means that you stay past your scheduled finishing time, and you don't complain about it as well. They were told specifically. It's just absolutely ridiculous to treat people in that way. And yeah, employers don't like it when the shoe's on the other foot. But we celebrate that.
That's right.
I mean, it was really interesting to speak to you again, and it just covered everything that we missed last time. So
I don't know if we got to everything. We might have to do at some point. But
yeah, maybe, yeah. God, yeah. There are plenty more things to cover. I'm sure we will speak again. But I just want to say to everyone, so there's Josh's article. Which is Climate Policy from a Keynesian Perspective first. And there's, remind me of the exact name of the supply constraints one.
I think it's Rethinking Supply Constraints is the title.
It's just Rethinking Supply Constraints. Yeah.
They're both on my website, which is at jwmason.org.
Yeah. Yeah, so absolutely fantastic. And follow Josh's blog as well, because you update it pretty regularly, don't you? And it's always interesting. I keep track of it. So there's so much insight I find in everything that you write. So it's, if you want to understand, well, economics, to be honest, but policy and the things we've spoken about, as well as some deeper theoretical issues too, then is one of my primary recommendations for everybody.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for this conversation. Okay. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I'm gonna finish the stream. Thanks to everybody for joining. We had like 200 plus viewers consistently for the whole 2 hours, which was pretty cool. And I guess I'll see you all in chat next time.